Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Harvard University's original founding motto was Truth for Christ and the Church.
Right.
And it actually carried this mandate that every single student know God. And, the YMCA, that was founded exclusively for the spiritual needs of young men in industrialized London.
Yeah, strictly spiritual.
Exactly. But today, both of those massive, globally recognized institutions have just completely abandoned their theological roots.
Completely.
They traded their explicitly Christ-centered mandates for basically a generalized secular humanitarianism. So the question is, how did that happen? And more importantly, if you're running a faith-based organization today, is your rescue mission next?
Well, it is a terrifying historical reality for any faith-based leader to confront. We're talking about a gravitational pull towards secularization that seems, honestly, almost unavoidable if you don't know exactly what to look for. And unfortunately, looking for it isn't easy. Diagnosing institutional mission drift, it's not like looking at a medical x-ray where a broken bone just shows up as a bright, jagged white line.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. Medical diagnoses are comforting because they're binary, right?
Yeah.
You're sick or you're healthy.
Exactly.
But organizational drift is murky. It's this slow, kind of invisible, calcifying disease that just sneaks up on a board of directors over decades.
Which is exactly why today's deep dive is so vital. We are going to build basically an organizational x-ray machine for you, the listener.
I love that.
Because if you're a leader within a gospel rescue mission or a city mission or really any faith-based nonprofit, you are dealing with immense operational pressures right now. So to help you understand the existential threats to your work, we're layering two really profound sources on top of each other today.
Right. So we are starting with this truly foundational, almost prophetic sociological text. It's H. Richard Niebuhr's seminal 1929 book, The Social Sources of Denominationalism.
It's a classic.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we're going to spend a lot of time unpacking his historical lens. But then we are going to bring that history right into the present moment by coupling it with Dr. Andrew Sears' 2026 report, which is called Rescue Missions and Secularization Risks.
Yeah. And the reason we're doing this is because Niebuhr provides this deep underlined sociological critique of how Christian institutions naturally evolve and, frankly, how they compromise.
Okay.
He forces us to look at the intersection of religious denominations and social class. And then, once we establish that historical framework, we'll apply it directly to the massive multi-million-dollar challenges facing modern gospel rescue missions today.
So you can actually figure out how to scale your operations without losing your institutional soul.
Exactly.
Okay, let's jump right into Niebuhr's core thesis, which was written almost a century ago, but it's a thesis that honestly stings a bit when you first read it.
Oh, it hurts.
It does. He calls the denominationalism within the Christian church an unacknowledged hypocrisy. Yeah, he is arguing that the divisions we see in the church, the fact we have Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, they aren't actually theological in their origin. Yeah. He says they represent the accommodation of Christianity to the human caste system.
The human caste system, that is a brutal phrase, and Niebuhr uses it very intentionally there.
Right.
His argument is that the division of churches closely tracks with the division of humanity into national, racial, and most importantly, economic groups.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, he points out this devastating irony. The gospel explicitly condemns divisiveness, right? It strictly condemns seating the rich and the poor apart.
Yes, very clearly.
Yet the profound social and economic inequalities in our society end up dictating the actual boundaries of our religious groups anyway.
Okay, wait, I have to push back on this just a little bit, or at least play devil's advocate for a second here.
Sure.
People care deeply about theology. Actual wars have been fought over predestination versus free will, or the proper mode of baptism. Niebuhr can't be suggesting that all of those passionate theological debates are just entirely fabricated cover stories for class warfare, can he?
Well, he isn't saying the theological opinions are fake or that the individuals holding them don't genuinely believe them in their hearts.
Right, okay.
But Niebuhr's sociological analysis suggests that human beings have this universal tendency to find highly respectable intellectual reasons for practices that are actually born out of basic social and economic conditions.
Oh, man. You know what that makes me think of?
What?
Sports rivalries.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Like, you'll hear a fan passionately argue that they absolutely despise a rival baseball team because of their management philosophy or their reliance on the long ball or, their lack of fundamental fielding.
Right, they have a whole analytical breakdown.
Exactly. They give you this entire intellectual breakdown. But at the end of the day, the real reason they hate that team is simply because they live in a neighboring rival city. The geographic reality created the tension, right?
Yeah.
The arguments about playing style are just the rationalizations that come later to make the hatred feel objective. So it's like the geography essentially dictates the theology.
That is a phenomenal analogy, yes. The civic rivalry is the underlying social condition. The arguments about management philosophy are the post hoc theological rationalizations.
Wow.
And Niebuhr actually illustrates this dynamic by going all the way back to the Pharisees and the Sadducees in ancient Judea.
Okay, let's look at that.
So the Roman Jewish historian Josephus, he described these two groups almost like competing Greek philosophical schools. The Sadducees famously did not believe in the resurrection of the dead or the existence of angels.
Right.
While the Pharisees believed in both.
Which is exactly how I learned about them in Sunday school, by the way. It was framed purely as a doctrinal dispute over text and tradition.
Right, but Niebuhr points out that this explanation is sociologically inadequate. The Sadducees were not distinguished from the Jewish masses, primarily by their esoteric religious opinions.
What were they distinguished by?
Their social character. They were the wealthy Hellenistic aristocracy. They were the political elite who collaborated with Roman authority to maintain their upper-class status.
Ah, okay. And the Pharisees?
The Pharisees were rooted in a fundamental racial and cultural loyalty that aggressively resisted the attempt to Hellenize Jewish civilization.
So they were more grassroots.
Much more.
Yeah.
They were closer to the common people, deeply invested in maintaining distinct cultural purity against imperial assimilation. So yes, profound differences of religious opinion existed between the two groups.
Right.
But Niebuhr argues those theological differences sprouted from far deeper soil, specifically, profound social, economic, and political divergences.
Man, so to bring this right to the doorstep of the listener today, if you are the CEO of a gospel rescue mission, or you're sitting on its board, Niebuhr's critique of the Pharisees forces a really uncomfortable audit of your own organization.
Extremely uncomfortable.
Because you can have the most orthodox, biblically sound statement of faith beautifully framed in your lobby. But Niebuhr is demanding that you look past what your organization says it believes and look at the actual socioeconomic realities of your institution.
You have to look at the demographics of power. Literally look at who is sitting in your boardrooms making the financial decisions.
Right.
And then look at who is sleeping in your shelters or attending your recovery programs. Are they from the same social caste? Do they share the same vocabulary, the same cultural touchstones, the same life experiences?
Probably not.
And if your mission is entirely bifurcated along economic lines, wealthy professionals in leadership and the impoverished margin in the program, Niebuhr would argue you are actively participating in that unacknowledged hypocrisy.
You're accommodating the caste system rather than transcending it.
Exactly.
That is a heavy diagnostic reality to confront. And it gets even more complicated when you look at how these institutions actually evolve over time, right? Because Niebuhr doesn't just offer a snapshot.
No, he maps out a whole timeline.
Yeah, a highly predictable life cycle for religious institutions. It's a cycle that moves from the disinherited all the way to the middle class. So let's trace this out. How does it usually start?
It begins with what he calls the established churches. Historically, think of the state churches of Europe or the highly established denominations in early America.
Okay.
Over time, these institutions become captured by the cultured, the wealthy, and the politically powerful elite. And when the elite take over, the nature of the religion subtly changes to serve their needs.
How so? Like, what actually changes?
Three things primarily. First, their theology grows highly abstract and intellectual.
It becomes an academic exercise.
Exactly, an exercise for the educated mind rather than an anchor for daily survival. Second, their rituals become very formal, predictable, and polished.
Right.
And third, their ethics become harmlessly compliant with the ruling class. Niebuhr calls this the morality of respectability.
The morality of respectability.
Yeah. It's a faith that doesn't challenge the economic status quo because the people running the church are benefiting immensely from that status quo.
So the church basically becomes an incredibly comfortable country club for the rich. But what does that feel like for everyone else? For the working class, the poor, the uneducated?
They find themselves religiously expatriated.
Just frozen out.
Totally frozen out. The established faith no longer meets their intense psychological needs, nor does it offer an ethical ideal that speaks to their suffering. I mean, imagine being an impoverished 18th century coal miner and walking into a cathedral where an aristocrat is delivering a dry, hour-long philosophical lecture on natural law.
It would be completely alienating.
Completely.
And sociologically speaking, nature abhors a vacuum. When a massive population is alienated like that and their spiritual needs are just ignored, they don't just disappear.
No, they revolt.
Right. This alienation sparks a spontaneous grassroots revolt. In response to being ignored by the elite, the lower socioeconomic strata create what Niebuhr famously coined the churches of the disinherited.
I love that phrase.
It's so powerful. The churches of the disinherited. How do these rebel groups operate differently from those established wealthy churches?
The contrast is night and day. First off, they are lay-driven. They aren't led by highly educated professional clergy with fancy seminary degrees.
Right, they're led by regular people.
Yeah, charismatic individuals from right within their own ranks. Second, the worship is highly emotional. They focus on an immediate, visceral, transformative religious experience rather than abstract intellectual assent.
They want to feel it.
Exactly. And third, they have a distinct ethical focus on mutual aid, fierce equality among members, and honestly, a radical critique of societal wealth.
And they often lean heavily into apocalyptic or millenarian hopes.
Crucially, yes. Think about it. When you are at the absolute bottom of the current social hierarchy, experiencing daily mundane hells of poverty or exploitation, you don't want a theology that preserves the status quo.
No, you want it all burned down.
You want a theology that promises a divine reversal of that hierarchy. You want a God who promises that the last shall be first, the first shall be last, and that the current corrupt system will eventually be overthrown.
You know, this cycle feels so much like the business world to me.
Oh, how so?
Think about a disruptive tech startup. You have a scrappy, hungry group of innovators that's disinherited in this analogy.
Right.
They look at a bloated, out-of-touch legacy corporation, the established church, and they realize it is totally failing the consumer. So they break away. They start operating out of a garage.
I see it.
They have zero money, but they have pure passion, raw energy, and they play by a completely different set of rules. They're nimble, they're deeply connected to the ground floor, and they fundamentally disrupt the market.
That startup analogy is perfect because it perfectly sets up the great tragedy of Niebuhr's cycle.
The tragedy of success.
Yes. What happens to a disruptive startup when its product is actually successful?
It scales, it acquires capital, it builds a massive headquarters.
And it eventually becomes the exact bloated legacy corporation it originally rebelled against.
Yeah.
Niebuhr argues that this exact same dynamic happens to the churches of the disinherited. There is a profound irony to their success.
Walk me through the mechanics of that irony. How does a movement of the poor accidentally make itself rich?
It happens through their ethics. As these new sects form, they enforce what sociologists call intraworldly asceticism.
Okay, intraworldly asceticism.
Right. Because they are seeking purity and separation from a corrupt world, they demand strict behavioral changes from their members. They demand industry, total sobriety, intense frugality, and the strict abandonment of destructive, expensive vices like gambling or drinking.
Which, if you think about it, are incredibly pragmatic survival mechanisms.
Absolutely.
Like if you tell an impoverished community to stop drinking their wages, start working tenaciously, save every single penny, and support each other's families, their material conditions are absolutely going to improve.
Inevitably. When marginalized people adopt those specific behaviors, they experience rapid upward economic mobility. And Niebuhr pulls a direct quote from John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, who watched this happen to his own movement in real time.
What did Wesley say?
He made this incredibly astute, almost tragic observation. He said, and I quote, "Religion necessarily produces industry and frugality, which cannot but produce riches, thereby causing the essence of religion to decrease in the same proportion."
Wow. That is a chilling observation.
It really is.
Causing the essence of religion to decrease in the same proportion.
Well, Wesley basically realized that the very virtues his religious movement instilled were making his people wealthy, and that newfound wealth was going to extinguish the spiritual fire that started the movement in the first place.
He saw the mutation happening right before his eyes. As the first generation of marginalized, passionate converts gives way to a second and third generation who are born into relative financial security.
The kids and grandkids. Right. The entire sociological structure of the group fundamentally alters. The sect transitions from a church of the disinherited into a church of the middle class.
So all those apocalyptic hopes just die out.
Entirely. Because they no longer want the world to be turned upside down by divine intervention. Why would they? They are now doing quite well in the current world order.
Right. They have a mortgage now.
Exactly. The raw emotional cries for justice are replaced by that mild, comfortable morality of respectability we talked about.
And the leadership changes too, I imagine.
Oh, completely. The passionate, unsophisticated lay evangelists are replaced by theologically educated professional clergy. The spontaneous, emotional worship is replaced by formal liturgy.
Can you ground this in some historical examples for us? Because this isn't just theory, right? This has happened repeatedly.
The text provides several striking examples. Look at the Anabaptists in the 16th century. They emerged among the peasants and poorer handicraftsmen.
Why them specifically?
Because official Lutheranism and Calvinism had very quickly become the aristocratic parties of vested interest, allied with the state princes. So the Anabaptists were the disinherited rebelling against that.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or look at the Quakers in 17th century England. They arose from the absolute dregs of the common people. They offered an emotional, direct experience of the inner light to those who were completely alienated by the dry intellectualism of the Presbyterians and Anglicans.
And John Wesley's Methodists in the 18th century.
Yeah.
Wesley led a massive revival populated by the weavers of Bristol and the coal miners of Kingswood, right?
Yes.
The brutalized industrial poor that the cold, polished, upper-class Anglican Church completely ignored.
Exactly. But look at those groups today. If you look at modern descendants of the Anabaptists or the Quakers or the Methodists, many of them are established, highly educated middle-class or upper-middle-class denominations.
They went through the exact sociological cycle Niebuhr described.
Yep. The raw, disinherited movement gentrified.
And when they gentrify, they abandon the very populations that birthed them. The newly middle-class church moves out to the suburbs, leaving a brand new generation of the urban poor totally unreached.
Which creates a new vacuum.
Right. And that vacuum necessitates the rise of an entirely new sect of the disinherited to start the whole cycle all over again.
It's a constant historical loop driven by economics.
But money and class aren't the only dividing lines here. Economics actually interact with physical geography in some really fascinating ways.
They do.
I want to shift to how environmental and political factors slice up denominations even further, specifically looking at Niebuhr's analysis of the American frontier.
Yeah. If we look at the broader sweep of American history, Niebuhr argues that the sheer geography of the advancing Western frontier created its own distinct religion. The physical environment profoundly mutated the theology that was brought over from Europe.
That is so interesting. How does physical geography change a theological doctrine?
Yeah.
What was it about the frontier environment that altered how people viewed God?
Well, think about the brutal realities of frontier life. Extreme isolation. Weeks or maybe months without communication with broader society.
Just trying not to die.
Literally.
Yeah.
The raw, daily, exhausting struggle for mere physical survival against the elements. These conditions act as a solvent. They strip away formal education. They strip away the polished inhibitions cultivated by settled urban society.
Right.
The emotional intensity of life on the frontier, the despair of a harsh winter, the sudden assurance of surviving a terrible illness that naturally birthed a highly emotional religion. It birthed the camp meeting and revivalism.
Right, because if you're a pioneer clearing a forest and you only see a traveling preacher once every 6 months, you don't have the time or the energy for a 3-hour, highly abstract intellectual sermon on natural theology.
No, you'd fall asleep.
You need something visceral. You need a faith that hits you right in the chest.
Furthermore, the frontier fostered a fierce love of democracy, individual experience, and equalitarianism. People out west deeply resented absentee control.
Yeah.
They hated politicians or bankers back east telling them how to live. And that resentment of absentee control translated directly into their religion.
I thought so.
They sought a personal religion anchored in the immediacy of their own experience. They looked with intense suspicion upon any administration of religion by superior powers or educated hierarchies back in Boston or Philadelphia.
Which sets up one of the most fascinating theological divides in American history. How did that geographic and cultural reality manifest in the battle between Calvinism and Arminianism?
It's a brilliant example of sociology driving theology. Calvinism, with its core doctrines of predestination and the elect, the idea that God in his sovereign authority, has already chosen who is saved and who is not, independent of human action.
Right.
That fit perfectly with the established, settled mercantile East. It was an orderly, hierarchical theology for an orderly, somewhat aristocratic society.
It made sense to the wealthy merchant that God, like a good manager, had prearranged the universe.
Exactly.
But that theology doesn't play well with the pioneer.
Not at all. Arminianism, conversely, emphasizes the cooperative activity of man in salvation. It highlights free will, individual choice, and the ability of anyone to respond to grace.
Ah, I see.
That theology perfectly suited the self-reliant, individualistic frontier West, a theology that stressed intense human effort and absolute equality before God, resonated deeply with pioneers whose entire physical survival was built on human effort.
And who had actively rejected the established social hierarchies of the East anyway.
Yes. The geography of the frontier essentially dictated which theology could take root and actually flourish.
Wow. Now, we have to look at another geographical divide that Niebuhr covers, and it's one of the most painful fractures in American history, the North-South split over slavery.
Yes.
And to be clear for you, the listener, we are going to look at this strictly through Niebuhr's sociological lens. We are impartially reporting his historical analysis here without taking political sides on modern equivalents.
Absolutely. We are acting purely as guides to the source material here.
Exactly. So he argues that the schisms in the American churches between the North and the South were rooted in tough economic realities, not just sudden moral epiphanies. So what does he say about those economic forces?
According to Niebuhr's historical analysis, the differing theological attitudes towards slavery evolved directly from the sweep of broader economic forces. The mercantile and rapidly industrializing North had a vastly different economic structure than the agrarian plantation-based South.
Right.
When the Northern churches began to deeply embrace abolitionism, Niebuhr points out that this moral stance was deeply intertwined with an economic reality that simply did not rely on enslaved labor to function.
But the Southern economy was entirely built on it. So how did the Southern church react when the abolitionist pressure really ramped up?
Under the vehement moral attacks from the Northern abolitionists, the South achieved a fierce new sectional solidarity. They rallied to defend their economic system, which they euphemistically called their peculiar institution. Because the Southern churches were deeply embedded in that culture and benefited from that economy, they felt obligated to form highly sophisticated moral and biblical rationalizations to defend and idealize slavery.
So the church fractured.
They fundamentally fractured from their northern counterparts. The Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists, they all split geographically. The underlying economic reality of the agrarian South demanded a theological justification, and the church provided it to protect the socioeconomic status quo.
It is a tragic, glaring example of denominationalism accommodating the caste system.
It really is.
Now, let's bring all of this historical weight right into the present moment. Just as economics shaped those denominations back then, modern social and economic complexities are aggressively shaping gospel rescue missions right now.
Yes, they are.
Dr. Sears' report explicitly links Niebuhr's historical cycle to the modern rescue mission movement.
Yeah, the report identifies modern gospel rescue missions as the direct institutional descendants of those early churches of the disinherited.
They are the disruptive startups of the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, when the gentrified middle-class churches abandoned the deteriorating inner cities, the rescue missions stepped right into the vacuum.
Precisely. To understand the immense secularization pressures facing your mission today, we really have to map how your institution evolved over the last 2 centuries.
Let's do that.
Dr. Sears' report breaks this evolution down into 5 distinct waves of innovation, with each wave representing a necessary adaptation to a changing urban environment.
I want to explore these 5 waves deeply, because this is the historical DNA of the listener's organization.
Right.
Let's start with wave 1. This is the City Mission Society, which ran roughly from 1815 to 1870. What was the catalyst here?
The catalyst was the sheer shock of the Industrial Revolution. Mass urbanization was happening at an unprecedented scale in places like London, Glasgow, and New York.
People moving from farms to the city.
Millions of people were pouring into urban slums to work in factories. This created profound physical squalor and deep spiritual crises. The traditional parish church system, which, was designed for a slow agrarian rural society, it completely collapsed under the weight of this new urban density.
It just couldn't handle it.
No. So innovators like Thomas Chalmers in Scotland and Johann Heinrich Wichern in Germany realized the old models were dead. They created the City Mission Society as a high-level interchurch coordinating body to bring comprehensive re-Christianization and social work to these deeply alienated populations.
But it was a bit high level, which necessitated Wave 2, which is the city mission, roughly 1826 to 1880. How did this wave alter the strategy?
Wave 2 is about actually operationalizing the strategy on the ground. A pioneer named David Naismith founded the Glasgow City Mission, and his core innovation was purely tactical.
What did he do?
Well, the societies in Wave 1 were often using wealthy, middle-class volunteers who couldn't really connect with the urban poor.
The caste system again.
Exactly. Naismith shifted to utilizing full-time, paid, working-class lay agents. He deployed frontline workers who actually shared the culture, the dialect, and the life experiences of the impoverished people they were serving.
That is brilliant.
It made urban evangelism and mutual aid exponentially more effective.
That brings us across the Atlantic to America for Wave 3. This is the Gospel Rescue Mission, 1870 to 1910. This is the era of the American Gilded Age.
This is a crucial era. Following the American Civil War, you had severe economic dislocation, waves of transience, and the birth of the American Skid Row.
And the traditional churches wanted nothing to do with this population.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Enter Jerry McAuley.
Tell us about Jerry.
McAuley was a notorious river thief in New York who had been converted while serving time in Sing Sing prison. After a period of relapse, he finally got sober and started the Water Street Mission in New York City. The massive defining innovation of Wave 3 was indigenous leadership by converted outcasts.
Which is incredible. The ministry wasn't just for the outcast. It was led by the formerly addicted, the former criminals, the formerly homeless.
Exactly. Their own transformed lives provided undeniable empirical proof of the gospel's efficacy to the people walking through the doors.
It's like, look at me, I was where you are.
Yes, it was the purest embodiment of the church of the disinherited.
But as these independent missions popped up in cities all across America, they ran into a new problem, which was isolation. Which leads us to Wave 4, mission networks, from 1900 to the present.
Because these rescue missions were fiercely independent and laid, they often lacked organizational stability.
Right.
When a charismatic founder died, the mission would often just collapse. To survive, they needed centralization. Networks began to form, most notably the Interdenominational Union of Gospel Missions, which today is known as the Citygate Network.
Oh, I'm sure many of our listeners know Citygate.
Absolutely. These networks allowed isolated missions to share resources, establish operational best practices, and create mutual accountability so they didn't just fail in a silo.
And that brings us to the present reality. Wave 5. The fifth wave mission, running from 2010 to the present. This is where the X-ray machine lights up with potential institutional disease.
The fifth wave is defined by extreme complexity. Modern missions are no longer just handing out a bowl of soup, hosting a sermon, and offering a cot for the night.
No, the stakes are way higher now.
They are forced to scale their operations to manage surging, incredibly complex crises. We are talking about severe mental health disorders, the lethal fentanyl and meth epidemics, and the need for massive real estate development to build transitional housing.
It's a completely different ballgame.
Furthermore, they are doing all of this within an intensely regulated, post-Christian, secularizing political environment.
And this complexity creates the defining leadership tension for anyone listening to this deep dive right now. Dr. Sears frames this as the battle between the complexity principle and the indigenous principle.
Yes, that tension is everything.
Let's break those down. Why does a modern mission need the complexity principle?
The complexity principle dictates that a modern mission simply cannot survive on good intentions and a Bible alone. It must integrate hard science, advanced organizational management, clinical psychology, and serious corporate business acumen.
Right, because of the scale of the problems.
If you are operating a 300-bed facility dealing with guests who have co-occurring severe psychiatric disorders and substance abuse issues, you need professional complexity. You need CPAs, certified public accountants, to manage the complex compliance of multi-million-dollar grants.
You can't just run that on a spreadsheet.
No. You need MSW's Masters of Social Work to design trauma-informed programs. You have to utilize general revelation.
But if you lean entirely into the complexity principle, you risk destroying the historical DNA of the movement. That's where the indigenous principle comes in.
Exactly. The indigenous principle is the heritage of Jerry McAuley. It demands that the missions stay culturally close to the poor.
It keeps you grounded.
It relies on grassroots relational ministry, the unparalleled credibility of lived experience, and an uncompromising reliance on special revelation, scripture and orthodox theology.
So the tension is this, and this is so hard. How do we become complex and professional enough to effectively handle modern crises without becoming so polished, clinical, and middle class that we alienate the very people we were founded to serve?
Which is exactly Niebuhr's cycle.
It is the Niebuhrian cycle playing out in the 21st century.
Yes. If the board of directors allows the complexity principle to totally override the indigenous principle, the mission gentrifies. It becomes a middle-class institution, it loses its soul, and it inevitably secularizes.
Okay, so let's look at exactly how that secularization happens, because it's rarely intentional, right?
Right.
A board of directors doesn't sit down on a Tuesday morning, look at the agenda, and vote item 4, let's abandon the gospel.
No, never.
It is an incremental, systemic accommodation. Dr. Sears' report relies heavily on resource dependence theory to explain this drift. What is RDT?
Resource dependence theory, or RDT, is a sociological framework that posits a very simple truth. An organization's survival is entirely contingent upon its ability to acquire resources from its external environment.
Okay, follow the money.
Always. Organizations are not self-sufficient. As rescue missions scale up to fight these massive fifth-wave complexities, their financial appetites grow exponentially. They need $10 million to build a new clinical health wing. They need huge payrolls to hire licensed therapists.
And their traditional donor base of, individuals writing $50 checks, that can't cover a $10 million capital campaign.
Exactly. This makes the mission highly vulnerable to external actors, massive secular corporate foundations, and most notably, government agencies, who hold immense power over those vital resources.
I think of this like taking venture capital money in the tech world.
Oh, good analogy.
When a startup is just a couple of founders in a garage, they own 100% of the company and they decide the culture. But when they want to scale globally, they have to take hundreds of millions in VC funding. And the second that check clears, they no longer answer just to themselves. They answer to the board of investors. And the investors don't care about the quirky original culture of the garage. They care about measurable returns.
Yes.
RDT suggests the exact same thing happens when a mission takes state money.
That is a brilliant translation of the theory. The report uses a really haunting historical analogy for this. It calls it the pinch of incense to Caesar.
The pinch of incense.
Yeah. In the early Roman Empire, Christians weren't initially asked to completely renounce Christ. They were just asked to pragmatically drop a tiny pinch of incense on the altar to the emperor to prove their civic loyalty and avoid persecution.
So it starts as a pragmatic compromise. You desperately need funding to keep the shelter doors open during a brutal winter freeze, so you accept a government grant.
But the state operates under secular bureaucratic imperatives. When they give you capital, they attach stipulations.
Of course.
And it never happens all at once. Maybe the first grant just subtly dictates that you cannot require chapel attendance for a specific subgroup of residents.
Okay, small compromise.
Then the next grant dictates a specific hiring practice that prevents you from asking about an applicant's faith.
Bigger compromise.
The next grant requires you to adopt secular clinical metrics to prove your success, completely ignoring spiritual formation outcomes.
Wow.
Over 10 years, what started as a small, pragmatic compromise to keep the heat on eventually re-engineers the entire organization. You quietly sideline your evangelistic core in favor of measurable, state-approved social outcomes.
And RDT partners with another terrifying sociological concept in the report, institutional isomorphism.
Yes.
Paul DiMaggio and Walter Powell coined this. How does isomorphism work?
Isomorphism simply explains the mechanics of why organizations operating in the same environment eventually start to look exactly like one another. They homogenize.
Okay.
For Christian social enterprises, it explains the gradual, almost invisible drift toward mimicking the exact structures and values of secular NGOs and state welfare agencies. The report identifies 3 mechanisms driving this: coercive, mimetic, and normative.
Let's walk through these because this is so important for our listeners. Give me a scenario for coercive isomorphism.
Coercive isomorphism stems from formal external pressures. Imagine a city zoning board telling a mission, you cannot get the permits to build your new transitional housing facility unless you adopt the city's exact secular anti-discrimination language in your bylaws.
Oh, wow. So they force you.
Yes. The environment is using legal and regulatory force to coerce the mission to change its internal structure.
Okay, what about mimic isomorphism? It sounds like mimicking or copying. Why do organizations do that?
They do it when they are scared or confused.
Interesting.
When the environment is highly uncertain, like a mission trying to navigate incredibly complex modern medical billing or clinical health requirements for the first time, the leadership naturally looks around and copies peers they perceive to be successful.
So they copy the big secular agencies.
Right. A rescue mission might blindly adopt the operational handbook, the org chart, or the clinical methodologies of a massive, heavily funded secular agency across town. By mimicking their operations, they unintentionally import the underlying secular philosophy embedded in those structures.
It's like saying, well, we don't know what we're doing. The secular agency seems to know what they're doing. Let's just copy their model.
Precisely. But the most insidious mechanism is the third one, normative isomorphism.
How does that one work?
This is driven primarily by professionalization. As missions embrace the complexity principle, they have to hire CPAs, HR directors, and licensed clinical social workers to manage the load.
And where do those professionals come from?
They come from secular academic universities. They have been exclusively socialized in a secular paradigm.
Oh, I see.
Let's say you hire a brilliant, secularly trained HR director. Over 5 years, that director quietly rewrites your employee handbook. They phase out theological vocabulary like sin, redemption, or repentance, and replace it with corporate DEI language, maladapted behaviors, and systemic barriers.
They change the whole culture.
They change the interview questions. Without rigorous theological counterformation from the leadership, the aggregate weight of these secularly trained professionals slowly, normatively overrides the mission's historic theological culture.
And this entire drift is often supercharged by what Dr. Sears calls the successor syndrome.
Yes. The fiery, mission-driven founder, the person who lived the indigenous principle, eventually retires or passes away.
Right.
The board of directors, which over the years has become heavily populated by corporate business leaders who prioritize efficiency and fundraising over theology, has to hire a successor.
And who do they pick?
They often hire a CEO based purely on operational competence. The new leader looks great on paper, but lacks deep theological alignment or institutional memory. They accelerate the mission drift by pursuing massive new market initiatives that fundamentally alter the organization's soul.
To help leaders visualize where they currently stand in all of this drift, the report provides a really helpful matrix: the 4 quadrants of cultural realities for missions. Let's map these out for the listener.
Okay, so quadrant 1 is total drift.
Not where you want to be.
Definitely not. This is an organization with low theological fidelity and low cultural fidelity. They have completely secularized and they have drifted away from the marginalized demographic they were founded to serve. Think of a highly dysfunctional, hyper-bureaucratic government social service office.
Got it. Now, quadrant 2 is secular social services.
Right. So this one has low theological fidelity, but high cultural fidelity. They are still serving the correct demographic, the urban poor, but they have entirely lost their spiritual core.
Can you give an example?
This is the modern YMCA model. They abandon the explicitly Christian focus for general secular social responsibility.
Okay, quadrant 3 is fascinating to me. Cultural drift or professionalization. I call this the Starbucks model.
That's a really good way to picture it. This quadrant has high theological fidelity, but low cultural fidelity. The mission defends its statement of faith robustly. The theology is orthodox. But the institution gentrifies. The culture, the architecture of the buildings, the vocabulary of the staff, it all becomes polished and upper middle class.
So they lose the indigenous principle.
Completely. It provides high-quality clinical services, but it becomes culturally distant and deeply alienating to the poor working-class origins of the movement.
Yeah.
A homeless individual walks into a lobby that looks like a high-end corporate tech campus and feels completely out of place.
And finally, the goal. Quadrant 4, mission true. The Dunkin' Donuts model.
High theological fidelity and high cultural fidelity. The mission successfully integrates professional excellence. It manages the complexities of the fifth wave while fiercely protecting its orthodox roots and its grassroots approachable culture.
So it's excellent but accessible.
Yes, it provides operational clinical excellence, but remains highly accessible and culturally resonant to the working class.
Dunkin' Donuts over Starbucks. I love that analogy. The coffee is excellent, but you don't feel like you need a certain socioeconomic status or a specific vocabulary just to walk through the door.
Exactly.
But maintaining that mission true quadrant is incredibly difficult today, which brings us to the macro environment in part 6, the post-Christian legal battlefield.
We have to zoom out and look at the cultural water we are swimming in. Historically, rescue missions operated with the implicit backing of a dominant Western evangelical culture.
Right.
Even if the broader society wasn't devout, they generally approved of Judeo-Christian ethics and viewed faith-based charity as a net positive. But today, Dr. Sears' report argues we have entered what sociologist Aaron Wren calls the negative world.
And as a reminder to you, our listener,
Yeah.
we are exploring the legal and cultural landscape strictly as it is analyzed in Dr. Sears' report. We are looking at the mechanics of the legal battlefield regarding politically charged issues, just objectively detailing the facts presented here.
Yes, absolutely. According to the report, the reality of the negative world is that in many major urban centers, Orthodox Christian theology, particularly regarding historical doctrines on human sexuality, gender identity, and the exclusivity of the gospel, is now viewed by the broader secular culture not just as outdated, but as actively harmful or bigoted.
Which changes everything for these missions.
It changes the entire operational landscape. This profound cultural hostility translates directly into legal and regulatory warfare against missions, and the primary battlefield is employment law.
The report calls this the hiring line in the sand. Why is employment law the ultimate hill to die on for a faith-based organization?
Because personnel is policy. The report's main warning is that the boundary of an organization's theological identity is ultimately determined by the people it employs.
That makes sense.
If a Christian organization is legally prohibited from utilizing religious criteria in its hiring processes, if the state uses forced non-discrimination laws to remove a mission's right to hire strictly co-religionists, then forced assimilation and secularization are mathematically inevitable.
Wow. Because if the people running the recovery programs don't share the doctrinal foundation of the mission, the programs will naturally drift towards secularism. Dr. Sears highlights two major legal case studies to illustrate just how intense this battlefield has actually become. Let's look at Woods v. Seattle's Union Gospel Mission. What happened there?
In this case, an applicant applied for a position in the mission's legal aid clinic. The mission denied the employment because the applicant's lifestyle explicitly contradicted the mission's established religious beliefs regarding sexuality.
Okay, and then what?
The applicant sued the mission under state anti-discrimination laws.
And what was the mission's defense in court?
The mission argued that they have a fundamental First Amendment right to hire co-religionists to maintain their missional integrity regardless of state anti-discrimination statutes.
Did they win?
While the Washington Supreme Court issued a ruling that created significant legal ambiguity for faith-based employers in the state.
That sounds dangerous for missions.
Very. While the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately declined to review the case at that time, Justices Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas issued a concurrence signaling that this specific clash between religious liberty and state non-discrimination law is inevitably coming to the highest court.
It's unavoidable.
The report uses this case to underscore the aggressive, coercive isomorphism state entities are using to force faith-based groups to conform to secular norms.
On the flip side, the report looks at Wyoming Rescue Mission, VEEOC. The EEOC is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, a massive federal agency. What was the conflict here?
Here, the mission faced serious threats from both federal and state agencies for declining to hire a non-Christian applicant for a thrift store associate position.
A thrift store position.
Yeah.
Not a pastor, not a program director.
Exactly. The government argued that a thrift store clerk is a secular role that shouldn't require a religious test.
But the mission disagreed.
Strongly. The mission viewed that role as integral to its holistic discipleship and recovery program, which often involves staff ministering to program participants who are working in the store.
Okay, so what was the outcome?
Backed by the Alliance Defending Freedom, or ADF, a major legal advocacy group, the mission successfully sued the EEOC. They secured a settlement reaffirming their legal right to hire exclusively those who share their faith, and the government was actually forced to pay their attorney's fees.
These cases really highlight the absolute stakes of the hiring line in the sand. And Dr. Sears provides a stark warning from Europe that American leaders need to heed right now. He points to the Stadt mission and the historic city missions in continental Europe. What is their current state?
Because of the expansive, heavily funded welfare systems in Europe, many of these historic city missions began accepting overwhelming percentages of government funding decades ago.
RDT in action.
Exactly. Yeah. Consequently, under RDT and coercive isomorphism, they were legally forced to abandon their Christian hiring requirements.
And today?
Today, the Stadt mission operate as highly effective, structurally sound, yet thoroughly secularized subcontractors of the state. The theology have completely gone.
Wow.
The report explicitly warns North American rescue missions that they must reject this funding paradigm if they wish to survive as distinctively Christian entities.
Okay, so the diagnosis is clear, and frankly, it is overwhelming. I mean, we have Niebuhr's historical cycle of gentrification pulling from the inside, and we have sociological pressures, RDT, isomorphism, and the legal battlefield attacking from the outside.
It's a lot.
If you are a leader listening to this, how do you actually navigate this? Let's move into the strategic solution.
Yeah.
The diagnostic and strategic framework for the fifth wave.
Right. To survive, you need a framework that aligns your operational strategy with your theology, ensuring that as you innovate to meet modern complexities, you don't accidentally alter your core identity.
What's the framework?
The report adapts a brilliant framework from the late missiologist Tim Keller called the Center Church Framework. It consists of 3 distinct layers: doctrinal foundation, theological vision, and ministry expression.
Let's break those down. What constitutes the doctrinal foundation?
The doctrinal foundation is your immovable anchor. It consists of the timeless, universal biblical truths that do not change based on culture or era.
Like what?
For gospel rescue missions, this foundation is deeply rooted in the historical free church tradition. It insists on the necessity of personal repentance, the ultimate authority of Scripture, and the inherent divine dignity of the Imago Dei, the image of God in every single person, no matter how broken they appear.
That foundation is solid, but theology has to hit the street, right? That's the second layer, theological vision.
The theological vision is essentially the middleware between absolute truth and current culture. It is the active process of cultural translation.
Okay, explain that.
It asks the critical question: how does our unchanging doctrinal foundation apply to this specific city at this specific time facing this specific crisis? Right.
For example, if your mission is dealing with an epidemic of severe trauma-induced meth psychosis, your theological vision must carefully integrate trauma-informed care and biological realities without ever losing the foundational conviction that ultimate healing requires spiritual redemption. It is the lens through which you view the current crisis.
And finally, the third layer, ministry expression.
This is the boots on the ground. This is how the vision physically manifests. It's your employee handbooks, the specific clinical modalities your therapists use, the physical architecture of your shelter, your marketing materials, and your fundraising tactics.
You know, this framework beautifully explains how mission drift actually occurs. Drift happens when there is a structural disconnect between the doctrinal foundation and the ministry expression.
Exactly.
For example, your mission's website, which represents your espoused values, might boldly state that you believe in the transformative power of the gospel. But down on the shelter floor, your enacted values, your actual recovery programs, are exclusively using secular cognitive behavioral therapy without any spiritual integration whatsoever. Spot on. When your espoused values don't match your enacted values, the organization is structurally compromised. And over time, the practical ministry expression will inevitably pull the doctrinal foundation downstream.
The tail wags the dog.
Yes. Your theology will eventually shift to match your daily secular practices.
To combat this drift and keep those 3 layers aligned, Dr. Sears provides a 3-part strategy for leaders. Let's walk through the actionable steps here. Strategy 1. Mastering complexity.
Missions cannot survive the fifth wave by retreating into an anti-intellectual fundamentalism. They must aggressively embrace professional excellence.
How do they do that practically?
First, this means utilizing regional alliances and nonprofit mergers to consolidate back-office operations. You need economies of scale to afford the CPAs and legal teams necessary for modern regulatory compliance.
Yeah, you can't do it alone.
Second, it means integrating tools like Christian cognitive behavioral therapy or CCBT.
What makes CCBT different from standard CBT?
Standard CBT is a secular clinical technique focusing purely on altering thought patterns. CCBT synthesizes that effective clinical technique with orthodox theological goals, addressing the mind while acknowledging the soul and the need for divine grace.
So it's best of both worlds.
It marries the complexity principle with the indigenous principle perfectly. Third, mastering complexity means investing heavily in advanced data architecture.
This is a crucial point. If you want to push back against a secular normative sociological environment, you can't just offer anecdotes. You need empirical data.
Exactly.
You need robust data systems proving that your spiritually integrated programs correlate directly with long-term housing stability and lasting sobriety. You have to speak the language of the secular environment, which is data, to prove the efficacy of your theological model.
Precisely. That brings us to strategy 2, enforcing Christian fidelity. This is your primary defense against normative isomorphism.
Okay, what's step 1 here?
First, you must implement uncompromising hiring practices. You must legally fortify your right to hire co-religionists. The report advises using legal advocacy groups like ADF to conduct comprehensive audits of your employment documents, your job descriptions, and your employee handbooks to ensure your First Amendment protections are ironclad.
Second, you have to look at the boardroom, strategic board composition.
You must actively prevent board gentrification. Yes, a modern mission desperately needs wealthy business executives and corporate leaders on the board to navigate complex real estate deals and massive fundraising campaigns.
You need their expertise.
But you must intentionally balance that corporate presence with orthodox pastors, theologians, and perhaps even program alumni. You need board members who possess the theological acumen to detect subtle shifts in your theological vision before they become permanent drift.
And fidelity doesn't stop at hiring or the board. It requires ongoing training. The report emphasizes rigorous staff catechesis.
Because you are forced by the complexity principle to hire MSWs and clinical staff who were educated in secular universities, your mission must function as an intense internal learning organization.
You can't just assume they know what to do.
Exactly. You cannot assume a Christian employee naturally knows how to integrate their faith with their secular training. You must continuously counterform your staff. You must explicitly teach them how to deploy their professional secular skills through a distinctively Christian worldview.
Strategy 3. Preserving the indigenous principle. How do we fight Niebuhr's cycle and stay culturally close to the poor?
First, aggressively promote lived experience. You must build internal leadership pipelines by actively hiring and promoting program graduates who have personally lived through the horrors of addiction and homelessness.
That credibility is huge.
A leader with lived experience provides unparalleled cultural credibility to the guests walking through your doors. Second, the mission must strive to stay in the radical middle, aesthetically and culturally.
Meaning, you offer world-class care, but you don't build a Starbucks.
Exactly. Keep the physical aesthetic, the rules, and the linguistic culture of the mission safe and resonant for the working class. Don't make the building so highly polished, sterile, and bourgeois that a marginalized addict feels alienated the moment they walk in.
And finally, the report highlights fostering an internal locus of control. This is a fascinating psychological distinction.
It is vital. Secular sociology heavily emphasizes systemic causes. It tends to treat poverty and addiction almost entirely as the result of biological realities or structural societal injustice.
Right, which takes away agency.
While missions must acknowledge systemic issues, their recovery programs must fiercely focus on individual personal responsibility. Utilizing the profound practical wisdom of the Serenity Prayer, missions must guide guests to focus their emotional and spiritual energy on changing the one thing they actually can control, themselves.
That's powerful.
You cannot treat guests as passive, helpless victims of systemic forces. You must empower them as active moral agents capable of transformation.
Which brings us to the ultimate defense mechanism, the final piece of the framework, the funding paradigm. At the end of the day, how you get your money dictates your future.
Resource dependence theory is ruthless. Whoever funds you controls you.
Simple as that.
The lure of massive, multi-million-dollar government contracts is the single most potent catalyst for mission drift. The report outlines a very clear typology regarding funding. Independent missions that operate with 0% government funding have a remarkably low secularization risk and possess maximum strategic agility.
But the trade-off is that they rely entirely on private donors, which can be highly volatile during economic downturns.
That is the stress of independence. But compare that to missions that operate with greater than 50% government funding. According to the report, their secularization risk is critical, bordering on inevitable.
Because of the strings attached.
They face the eventual loss of their religious hiring rights and functional absorption into the secular welfare state, just like the European Stadtmissionen.
So what is the solution? How do missions fund the massive capital requirements of the fifth wave without selling their soul to the state?
Missions must aggressively build an entrepreneurial funding architecture. They cannot rely solely on the offering plate. They need robust, revenue-generating social enterprises.
Like what?
We are talking about advanced multi-location thrift operations, vocational training businesses, and coffee shops that generate significant unrestricted income.
And what if they absolutely have to touch state money for a specific crisis. Say, a city asks them to open an emergency cold weather shelter to stop people from freezing to death on the street.
If they touch state money for basic humanitarian relief, they must utilize strict subsidiary legal firewalls. They must legally and financially separate the government-funded humanitarian work from their deep-dive, privately funded residential discipleship programs.
The funds cannot mix.
Never. And most importantly, if a government contract requires even the slightest dilution of their core doctrine or their right to hire Christians, the mission leadership must have the institutional courage to walk away from the money.
Rejecting $1 million check to save the soul of the mission. It is an agonizing decision, but historically necessary.
It is the only way to survive.
Well, we have covered incredible ground today. We started with Niebuhr's haunting sociological warning from 1929 that successful religious movements, the disruptive startups of the disinherited, naturally, gravitationally drift toward middle-class accommodation, gentrification, and secularization as they achieve wealth.
Right.
And we trace that exact historical cycle all the way to the modern fifth-wave realities that threaten to use regulatory complexity and government funding to turn our gospel rescue missions into sterile, subcontracted social services.
It is a profound, almost tragic historical arc, but understanding the mechanics of that drift is the absolute only way to stop it. Niebuhr showed us that movements inevitably lose their original fire when they achieve success and respectability, and this raises an essential, highly provocative thought for our listener to mull over as they leave us today.
Let's hear it.
If you are a mission leader, I want you to consider this deeply uncomfortable possibility. Your organization's massive operational success, your $50 million annual budget, and those beautiful state-of-the-art new clinical facilities you just built, those might actually be the greatest hidden threats to your spiritual survival.
Wow.
How do you plan to intentionally architect a culture that stays spiritually hungry and culturally close to the disinherited while simultaneously becoming operationally excellent? Ask yourself honestly, are your massive new buildings saving your mission, or are they quietly gentrifying it?
Are they saving it or gentrifying it? That takes us right back to our opening metaphor. You cannot just assume the organizational bones are healthy because the building looks impressive on the outside.
No, you can't.
You have to use this historical and sociological X-ray to look deep inside the marrow of your institution. Look at your hiring practices, look at the stipulations on your funding, look at the socioeconomic makeup of your boardroom, and ensure your espoused values match your enacted values right down on the shelter floor.
Amen to that.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this historical and strategic framework helps you navigate the incredibly turbulent waters ahead while remaining inextricably tethered to your founding mission.